Welcome to the Ethics of Working with Stories within Organizations. I'm Rachel Bolton. I'm here with Birgit Williams, and over the next little while, we're going to be diving into this topic that is near and dear to our hearts. Our clients have tremendous success with organizational development and transformation when storytelling and story sharing are an integral part of the change process. Taken into consideration is the ethics of storytelling and story sharing in an organization when it's formalized as activities within the organization and not just the informal type of storytelling that can happen and happens commonly in the parking lot or at the coffee machine. Experience has taught us the value of the organization, including in their statement of ethics, a statement of ethics for working with stories within the organization. This is valuable for the purposes of organizational development and transformation, and it's essential when working meaningfully with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Over the next few minutes, we're going to be providing 9 recommendations of what could be included in a statement of ethics for working with story within organizations, as well as 6 tips for the story facilitator.
So Rachel, what you're speaking about is when an organization is undergoing its intentional development, when an organization is undertaking an organizational transformation. It's super valuable to take time within the process for storytelling and story sharing as an activity, as something that is planned for, that story is important, that storytelling and story sharing are important parts of the process. And so that was one really important point that you were making as a big tip for people. The second part of what you were speaking about has to do with including a statement of ethics specifically geared to storytelling and story sharing in the organization. So some organizations have a statement of values. They might call it a statement of ethics. And you are emphasizing how valuable it is that they include in this statement something about this storytelling and story sharing, a statement of ethics, particularly about story.
Yes, and I know in our work, we find storytelling and story sharing activities, we like to use them as a regular part of the ways in which we develop organizations. So it can be really helpful to have it embedded within that broader statement of values or statement of ethics like you're talking about. But also in those one-off moments of we're bringing this group of people together at this time for the purpose of storytelling, to consider having something just that's exclusive to that moment if it's not part of the regular activities of an organization. So when you're thinking about this, I think for the purposes of today and our video and what we're exploring, thinking about it in what are all of the right ways that we can create this kind of statement of ethics. We want to frame what we're about to share with you within some context, and that context within which storytelling and story sharing take place, we think is a really valuable first step in understanding what might be beneficial to have in your statement of ethics. There is context at the global, organizational, and individual level. The global context within which we are living right now at the point of recording this video is really a time of collectively living in liminal space. The old normal is now in the past, and what is next is not yet known. On the plus side, liminal space is where transformation occurs, and the world is rife with opportunity at this moment. On the negative side, spending too long in the unknown is overly challenging to the human psyche. We're constantly seeking stability and certainly have been without that for quite a while now. Story sharing is a tool that helps humans to make sense of what has come up to now and to begin to see the shape of what is to come. At an organizational context, organizations today face tremendous pressure to continually tell the most positive stories. Organizations, whether consciously or unconsciously, stifle more negative stories, even at the expense of the health and wellness of their staff. When organizations stifle negative stories as part of their policy to manage their brand reputation, it can have a negative impact on those internal to the organization, as their lived experience might be different from what the organization's public persona is. When used often, story sharing can help to detect patterns or emerging organizational stories that can help an organization to genuinely develop a life nourishing culture devoid of discord or scandal rather than hiding it. At the individual level, we believe that people long to be their whole selves without fear of rejection or ridicule. We want to be heard, understood, and accepted. At the same time, more and more pressure is being put on people, particularly diverse people, to share their stories on demand, regardless of what further trauma or harm it might cause them. As a result, there's an opportunity for story sharing to be invited in respectful and ethical ways, an opportunity to ensure all stories are invited in equitable ways. What does taking all of this context into consideration mean? Within an organization, given all this context, we must consider how high the stakes are for a person daring to share a story, especially if it's a story that others, especially the leaders, do not want to hear and disagree with. It's critical to be aware of and responsible for what needs to be in place to create a context in which storytelling and story sharing are used for healing and development rather than harm.
I love this beginning point, which is to sit back and examine the context rather than just, getting into, okay, here's some tips for you. Here's some guidance for you. It is to step back and say, we are all operating in our organizations within a bigger context. And it's worthwhile to look at that, to develop some understanding of it, to talk about it within the organization, to talk about it at the level of leadership of the organization, to say there is a context within whatever we do is taking place. And some of that context that you referred to, Rachel, is about that liminal space, that threshold space of the past is no more, the future is not yet known, and hanging out in that liminal space. And people in organizations can be within that liminal space for a considerable period of time, depending on what's going on in that organization. And right now, it is also within the bigger world context. So that uh, that bears paying some attention to. Is that what's happening? Then I really took in what you were talking about to do with people who represent a diversity being asked increasingly to tell stories, to tell their story. They might be ready to tell their story or not. It might be within a context in which it feels nurturing to tell it. It might be within a context where it feels depleting to tell it. And great care must be taken. And an example that I have from my work in the past, this had to do with people who were diverse in terms of mental health regards. That had to do with people who were who had schizophrenia or were uh, uh, or other illnesses. I don't want to start listing them all. And being asked, because it became the done thing nationwide, that people with different mental health issues were to sit on different boards of directors to represent their population. So what you'd end up with was one person representing people with mental health challenges sitting on a board and being asked to tell their story over and over again. And those people got exhausted. They felt used. They didn't feel heard and understood. Their story wasn't valued. They felt that it was a token uh, opportunity to tell the story so that the group could say, well, we're paying attention. But it didn't feel to those people that it was making a difference. And I think that if the people in the organizations had sat back and really looked at the context, looked at why they were asking for these stories, and looked at what they were going to do with the stories, and how to support the storytellers, the story sharers, this could have gone quite differently.
That's a great example. And it makes me think, we framed it in this video as the context of now, globally and organizationally and individually from our current perspective in a general way, but how valuable it can be as one is considering what it means to have a statement of ethics around storytelling and story sharing in an organization, that it's valuable to really consider what is our unique context, what do we need to pay attention to and make sure we're being aware of and including within this so we get it right within our unique context. Another layer before we get to the actual tips is considering the power of stories. Stories are definitely powerful. They touch our hearts and souls. They coalesce our thoughts in ways we might not have expected. Facilitating an activity using stories because of the power of stories is much more than an activity. Stories are so powerful that they touch people deeply enough to help them heal from old emotional, spiritual, psychological wounds and traumas. This healing can occur by listening to a story and sharing stories. Stories are powerful cross-culturally and universally. Let's take a look at the power of stories in organizations within that context. If a leader chooses to tell a story, such as one with the theme of, like, we're one big happy family here, and this is not what the people in the organization are experiencing, discord rather than healing occurs. The story is remembered, it can be ridiculed and gossiped about, and it can set a new low bar for poor employee morale. If a person shares a story that they're mad or sad about, and others do not feel the same way about the story, reactivity to the story can be harmful. It can be reactivity in the story sharing session. It can also be after the story sharing session, directly aimed at the person and the story, possibly ridiculing the person or scoffing at the story. The story, whatever it is remembered, and the feelings are remembered, and it sets up problems within teams and within the organization as a whole. In our work as consultants who are brought in to find solutions to problems, we've often traced the current situation to a story dating back a decade, sometimes even longer. A story can have that kind of power. When someone shares a story that they're glad about with genuine joy, the story, on the other hand, can powerfully uplift all the people listening and help set a tone and a direction in the organization's development. If the leaders agree with the tone and direction instigated by the story, they will reinforce it, giving the story even more power. Suppose that the leaders disagree with the tone and direction instigated by the story. In that case, they can find themselves in a difficult position because the people will remember the story that touched their hearts.
So Rachel, you're saying that the power of stories is such that it can affect a life-nourishing trajectory or a life-depleting trajectory, a harmonious trajectory or a trajectory of discord. And there are a number of factors that would affect which way that goes. And I take this back into the power of stories. I take it back to the subject that we had just covered, which is about the context. And then I take that back to the subject of this video, which is about the ethics of working with stories within organizations. So, what I'm believing is about to happen is that after sitting and really understanding that stories are very powerful. It's not just an activity to be done to do story sharing, but they're very, very powerful. That there is an importance in how the storytelling and story sharing is set up, what the context is that's created for it, and also back to this statement of ethics that is going to be about working with stories within the organization so that ultimately the trajectory that gets created is one of harmony and one that is life nourishing rather than one of discord and one of life depleting.
I think something that struck me as we were sharing is the necessity of also creating the right spaces for those negative stories, or the ones we perceive as being negative, being shared in ways that also create that more life nourishing and more beneficial environment. And this statement of ethics and the conscious ways in which we work with stories, I think help go a long way to help creating the conditions for that to be positive.
And so we're not in any way in what we're saying in any way suggesting that we stay only with positive stories. In fact, earlier on, you talked about the harm that can be done when people are being asked to share only positive stories, even if they might not resonate with them. The scope of the storytelling and story sharing absolutely needs to include stories that people are angry about, or that they're happy about, or that they're sad about, the full spectrum, so that they can show up as whole persons.
Absolutely. Increasingly in our work, we find also as one more layer of context, and I think this is the last layer of context that we're going to walk into before we start sharing some recommendations for you. But we're noticing very much and appreciating very much that we are aiding organizations to have a framework for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging within which all of the organization's activities are being undertaken. For most organizations, this framework of how people are included and how they can show up as whole persons that they are, with the acceptance from others that comes from a belonging culture, requires an organizational transformation. A culture that accepts people for who they are also accepts all the stories they tell and share. In other words, organizations with a culture of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging are ideal for the many benefits from the power of stories. And organizations that intend to foster a greater sense of equity, inclusion, and belonging can use storytelling and story sharing as one way to support this work.
I'm thinking from the perspective of being the person who is the storyteller to a person sharing stories. And I'm thinking about some organizations that I'm part of. And some of those organizations have a culture of belonging. And I feel really able to express myself, to express my stories, to believe that I'm not going to be judged either for the story or for having the story for who I am. And then I belong to some other organizations where I find myself less willing to share stories, to tell stories, because even though I am part of those organizations, the only stories that are accepted are stories that are of what I call like-mindedness. There's a very narrow bandwidth for the stories that are accepted, and it's known, even though it's not really talked about, that if you take stories outside of that bandwidth, that there is a reactivity that happens, a judgment that happens. So I'm thinking that myself as a storyteller and as a story sharer, even if the organizations haven't formalized that they're a culture of belonging. People like myself inside of those organizations can feel whether that belonging of the whole self is genuine or not. You can feel it, you can silence yourself, or you can express yourself depending on what you're picking up about the organization.
One of the tools as a facilitator of storytelling and story sharing then that becomes really important is working with the sponsor to develop this kind of statement of ethics if it doesn't already exist, because it lets you know that you are in fact, as you work through it and verifying what is true for them about their ethics, that it is the right conditions and that in fact all stories and therefore all people are welcome as whole people. So we're going to walk now into our recommendations. We've got 9 recommendations of what to think about in terms of what you want to include in a statement of ethics for working with stories within your organization. And I'm going to run through them all, and then we can have a moment to unpack it a little bit together. So the first of those considerations for developing your statement of ethics is that storytelling and story sharing should always be invitational rather than mandatory. The invitation clearly outlines the purpose of the event, whether the stories are documented and how the stories will be shared and with whom, and the expected outcomes of the storytelling or story sharing activity. This leads to the second point, which is about informed consent. With that invitation in hand, that invitees can ask questions about the event to have the information they need to make an informed decision about taking part. Specifically, they need to satisfy themselves about how the stories they share will be used and by whom. Participants must be able to decide if they're comfortable or not taking part. There cannot be repercussions from the organization for those who choose not to attend, as it's clear that people have the right to make their own choice. Self-representation is our next point of consideration, that there are measures in place to ensure each person has the opportunity to tell their own story based on firsthand experience. It is made clear that telling another person's story is not tolerated, as the other person has their own right to their own story without the possibility that someone else might misrepresent them in it. We believe that it's important to have a multiplicity of voices. One story from one voice is not more important than other stories from other voices. We must pay attention to the multiplicity of voices, to identify and invite them, to hear them, to learn from them, and to take them all into account when drawing conclusions from the stories. This is about noticing who is in the room and what stories they're sharing, and also who is missing and what stories aren't being told, and then taking the steps necessary to add those into the multiplicity of voices. We recognize that the multiplicity of voices gives us the most accurate picture to develop or transform our organization. To ensure that the multiplicity of voices is heard, we use best practices of participatory meeting methods like whole person process facilitation, open space technology, appreciative inquiry, and World Cafe. There are also many other credible methods that are listed in the Change Handbook as a great resource for looking at ways of working with story and working with participatory methods with organizations. Documentation is number 5 out of the 9 of our list. If stories are documented, the person sharing the story must be given the opportunity to verify the documentation is suitable and accurate from their perspective, and have the right to edit it if they don't believe it is. Ideally, the person sharing the story has the right and responsibility to document the story themselves for insertion into the full document of the story sharing event. 6 is delivery. The delivery of the storytelling and story sharing event must align with the statement of ethics. it must be in alignment with what is stated in the invitation. So the design of the facilitation, the way that the event unfolds, needs to be what was described to start with. Objective facilitation is another important factor in your statement of ethics. Engaging a skilled facilitator to facilitate the storytelling and story sharing events, one who has developed their capacity to remain objective, neutral, mindful, and listen deeply to what is happening. It's valuable to have a commitment to making sense of the stories, to review the documentation and the memories of the storytelling and story sharing, and to go through activities to make sense of the stories for the benefit of people and the organization. When making sense of the stories by categorizing them in different ways, mapping the data to different points, finding common themes, or in other ways, the people must be involved in a participatory way. And our last point is about ensuring that there's good follow-up, to be clear about what can be expected after the story sharing event. What will happen after the making sense of stories and distributing the documentation? Are there planned next steps for organizational development or transformation that this story sharing contributes to? Will the stories shared impact decisions? If so, how? Will there be a follow-up session or future story sharing? Knowing this from the outset shapes the ethical approach to how stories are shared, captured, and worked with. These are 9 points that we feel are really common considerations for developing a statement of ethics for storytelling or story sharing within an organization. It's valuable to consider also other unique elements to include based on your organization's culture and the purpose for inviting stories at this time.
I think those 9 points are very, very thorough in terms of what could go into a statement of ethics. I realize, Rachel, that you said that people can add or alter slightly because of their unique organization, and yet this makes a very thorough picture of what can go into the statement of ethics. One of the points that you made, and you made this point under the point of delivery, and that is after that the absolute essential necessity, I'm stumbling on my words here, but of following through on what one says one is going to do. And I think of all the points to do with ethics, it's to have that integrity that if you say something's going to be a certain way, to make sure that in the delivery it is that way. If you say it's going to be invitational, it must be. If you say that there can be informed consent, that people aren't going to get retribution if they don't come. All of those points that were made absolutely need to be carried out in a way that has integrity in accordance with that statement of ethics. I feel that running through all these points, it is about saying what you're going to do and then doing it as an organization. As for what for me is the most important underlying point of these 9 points.
I think for me, it's also like that underlying saying what you mean and then doing what you say is so integral, but it also is about demonstrating right from the beginning a real care and commitment and concern and respect for the stories that are shared and the people who are sharing them. And so all of this together for me creates a really powerful foundation on which that care gets demonstrated. And when we're asking for people to share those stories that have such power, it's so valuable to treat the people and their stories with respect in this way.
That holds very much true to stories that are delightful stories to hear, as it is to ones that feel really uncomfortable to hear, and to have respect for the person for telling the uncomfortable story, even if that story might not come out in the best possible ways. it is coming out, and it's a story, and it might be a story of something they're angry about or sad about. It might not be polished. It probably isn't. It is probably going to have some emotion with it. And in listening to it, it can cause people to feel uncomfortable, and they might not know what to do with that uncomfortable set of emotions. And yet we're creating the container with this statement of ethics that says all these stories are welcome, and that there's going to be respect given to including all the stories.
So we promised you these 9 points of recommendations for developing your statement of ethics. We also said we would give you 6 tips as a story facilitator for working with this concept. And as we wrap up for today, we want to give those to you. The first is to remember that storytelling and story sharing are not simply an activity, rather that they have significant impact. Whether the impact is life nourishing or life depleting is reliant on how you set up the activity. We want to offer you the tip to ensure that you have a planning process with the sponsor prior to facilitating story sharing events. Consider for yourself what feels important from our suggestions that you want to include in your planning process related to the ethics of working with story. Early in that planning process for working with story, include a discussion for your own learning about what the sponsor already has or does not have about their statement of ethics for storytelling and story sharing. Do not make the assumption that they do not have something in place already. And the last 3, if they don't have that statement of ethics already, help them to develop one with the 9 points that we have shared with you. This includes considering how and where this statement of ethics will be shared. Ideally, the conditions in an organization within which storytelling and story sharing take place are ones that value diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Consider in your planning what you want to be aware of and include support for this. And the last one that we want to offer to you is not to declare that the space you've created is a safe space. Safety is not something that can be assured when a group of people are together. It can also limit the stories that are shared for fear of uncomfortable reactions, hurt feelings, or touching someone's traumatic experiences. Instead, focus on creating the most life-nourishing conditions possible so that the conditions are present for people to show up and be fully present as whole people who share stories and work with stories for healing and transformation.
Rachel, I'll speak only to that last point. It's one that I feel so strongly about for when facilitators believe that they can create a safe space and they declare to the participants that they have created a safe space. I believe that facilitator is making a big mistake. As you said, we don't know what feels safe for someone and what doesn't feel safe. We cannot, as facilitators, guarantee safe space. And I loved what you put in the turnaround of that is let's create the most life nourishing space that we can for the storytelling and story sharing. We've given lots of guidance in this video with all that has been said for how to create that life nourishing space. And if we're going to talk to the participants about the space that has been created, we can say that we've made every effort for it to be life nourishing and not life depleting. It's not a guarantee. However, we've made every effort for it to be so. And I think that's the best we can do.
And on that note of the best we can do, we come to the end of our tips for story facilitators. We've offered you some context, some recommendations on what to consider in a statement of ethics, and these tips for story facilitators as we work in ethical ways with the stories that exist in people and in organizations. That's just about the end of our video for today. Before we sign off, is there anything else that you want to close with, Birgit?
Only to say to use storytelling and story sharing as often as possible in all of your processes. There is a power in stories to heal, to transform, and of course, as per the subject of this video, to make sure that you've paid attention to those ethics for story, working with stories within organizations. And you will do a lot to move organizations and the people in them in their development if you do so.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our video, and we're very much looking forward to hearing from you how it is that you are working with these statements of ethics and working with stories in organizations.